story of secrets, betrayal, and the truth that could not stay buried, Part 1. What the dead leave behind. The morning of my grandmother's funeral, I burned my toast. I stood in my small kitchen, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling fan, and I thought, this is how grief works. It doesn't announce itself with a clean, dramatic knock. It sneaks in through the ordinary things. The forgotten toast, the unwashed coffee mug still sitting in the sink from the last morning you spoke to her, the stupid habit of reaching for your phone to call someone who will never answer again. Her name was Edith Clara Morse. She was 79 years old. She smelled like lavender and old paper, and she made the best apple cake I have ever eaten in my life. And she is gone, and I did not get to say goodbye. That last part was the thing that sat heaviest in my chest as I drove the 2 hours from my apartment in Columbus to my mother's house in Millhaven. That small, manicured Ohio town where I grew up and could never quite escape, even after I did. I hadn't seen Grandma Edith in 4 months. We'd talked on the phone, of course. We always talked on the phone. But the last time I drove home to sit with her, to hold her small, papery hands and let her tell me stories about people I'd never met, had been the previous Thanksgiving. And I had left early because my mother and I got into one of our arguments, and I had promised myself I'd come back at Christmas. And then Christmas came, and I was working overtime and the roads were icy, and I told myself, there will be time. There is always time. There was not always time. I know that now. My name is Claire Morse. I am 28 years old. I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood the particular landscape of us. The tensions, the silences, the careful choreography of holidays and phone calls. I thought our secrets were small ones. I was wrong about everything. The funeral was held at First Lutheran on Maple Street, the same church where my grandmother had attended services every Sunday for 50 years. The same church where my parents were married, where I was baptized. The pews were dark wood. The light came through amber-tinted windows, and the whole space smelled of candle wax and old hymnal books. There were perhaps 60 people. Neighbors, old friends from her quilting circle, a few distant relatives I recognized only by their resemblance to people I actually knew. My mother, Patricia, sat in the front pew, composed and dry-eyed in a way that I had always admired and slightly feared. She was wearing a black wool dress that she had bought specifically for this, I noticed. Too new, the fabric still sharp at the creases. She had taken charge of the arrangements the way she took charge of everything. Efficiently, completely, leaving no room for anyone else's input or grief. My Uncle David, my mother's brother, sat 2 seats away from her with his wife, Maureen. He looked genuinely wrecked. Red-rimmed eyes, jaw clenched, hands folded in his lap so tightly his knuckles were pale. Uncle David had always been my grandmother's favorite. Everyone knew it, and for as long as I'd been alive, my mother had pretended not to care. I sat next to my mother. She reached over and patted my hand once, briefly, efficiently, the way you'd pat a railing to check its sturdiness. Then she folded her hands back in her lap. The pastor spoke about grace and enduring love. The choir sang a hymn I half remembered from childhood, something about rivers and crossing and the peace waiting on the other side. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm and focused on breathing. Afterward, at the graveside, the wind picked up. November in Ohio is a gray, merciless thing. It got under my coat and pressed against my face, and I watched them lower my grandmother into the ground. And I thought about the last thing she had ever said to me, on the phone, 6 weeks before she died. Claire, sweetheart, I need to tell you something. I had been distracted. I was at work, eating lunch at my desk, one eye on a spreadsheet. I'd said, "Of course, Grandma. What is it?" in the tone you use when you're half listening. And she'd gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Not on the phone. You should come home. I have something to show you and something to tell you." I had said I would come soon. I had meant it. She died 3 weeks later, a Tuesday, a stroke, fast and total. No goodbyes. Standing at that grave in the November wind, I pressed my fist against my mouth and felt the weight of every conversation I had not prioritized, every visit I had deferred. I heard her voice, saying I have something to show you, and I understood, with the particular cruelty of hindsight, that she had been trying to tell me something important. Whatever it was, I thought, it was buried with her now. I was wrong about that too. The reception was at my mother's house. She had ordered food from a catering company. Small sandwiches, fruit trays, those little quiches I'd always hated. People moved through the familiar rooms of my childhood home, speaking quietly, filling their plates, offering my mother condolences she received with practiced graciousness. I drifted. I spoke to people when they spoke to me. I drank 2 glasses of white wine too fast and felt it sitting uneasily on my empty stomach. At some point, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the room that had been Grandma Edith's when she'd moved in 3 years ago, after her second fall. The door was open. The room smelled faintly of her. That lavender, that old paper, old. My mother had already started clearing it, I noticed. The nightstand was bare except for the lamp. The framed photographs that had crowded the dresser were gone, presumably boxed. The room felt stripped, scrubbed of her presence in a way that made me unsteady on my feet. But on the bed, there was a box. It was a plain cardboard box, roughly the size of a shoebox but flatter, and on top of it was a folded piece of paper with my name on it. Not typed. Handwritten in my grandmother's distinctive looping script. Claire? I looked down the hallway. I could hear the murmur of the reception from the other end of the house. I stepped into the room and picked up the note. My darling Claire, I asked David to make sure you found this. I meant to give it to you myself. I am sorry I ran out of time. It is yours. It has always been meant for you. Please read everything inside carefully. I love you more than I have ever been able to say properly. Grandma Edith. My hands were shaking. I set the note down and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded blue velvet, was a Bible. It was old, genuinely old. The cover worn black leather cracked with age, the gilt lettering nearly rubbed away. I could just make out the words, Holy Bible, and beneath them, in slightly clearer script, E. Margaret Holloway, 1962. A name I didn't recognize. I turned it over in my hands. It was heavier than it looked. I opened the front cover, and a folded piece of paper slipped out and fell onto the bedspread. I picked it up. It was not old paper. It was standard white notebook paper, slightly yellowed, but the handwriting on it was my grandmother's. The same hand that had written my name on the note outside. The date at the top read March 14th, 2019, 7 years ago. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read, Claire, my love, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time, and for that I am more sorry than I can say. There are things you deserve to know, things I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of what it would do to your family, afraid of hurting people I love, afraid of being wrong. But I am old now, and I understand that the truth does not become less true because we are afraid of it. It only becomes more dangerous. I am going to ask you to do something difficult. I am going to ask you not to trust your mother. I love Patricia. She is my daughter and I love her. But she has done something I cannot forgive, something she has never confessed, something that has been quietly destroying this family for 30 years. And I believe you are old enough and strong enough to know the truth. Inside this Bible, you will find things that I have gathered over many years. Letters, photographs, a document. They will explain what I cannot explain simply. Read them in order. They are numbered on the back. But before you do, I want you to know that none of what you discover will change who you are. You are remarkable, Claire. You are more yourself than anyone I have ever known. Whatever the truth is, it is the ground you grew from. It is not the sky above you. I love you. I am sorry. Find out the truth. Your Grandma Edith. I sat on that bed for a long time. From down the hall, I could hear my mother's voice. That measured, controlled tone she used in social situations, the one that made her sound like she was running a very pleasant meeting. I could hear my Uncle David's low rumble in response. I could hear the clink of plates and the subdued music of a funeral reception, everything ordinary and civilized and completely unknowing. My hands were still shaking. Do not trust your mother. I reached back into the Bible. Tucked into the pages, each folded small and labeled with numbers on the back in pencil, were 7 items. I laid them carefully on the blue velvet cloth and looked at them like a hand of cards I was afraid to turn over. Item 1. I unfolded it. A photograph. Black and white, slightly blurred, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge. 2 people standing close together on what looked like the front porch of a house I didn't recognize. A man and a woman. The man had his back mostly to the camera. I could see dark hair, broad shoulders, a heavy jacket. The woman was in profile. Even blurred, even younger by decades, I recognized her. My mother, Patricia Morse, née Holloway. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. She was looking up at the man beside her, and even in the poor quality of the photo, Even at this distance of years, there was something in her expression I had never seen on my mother's face in my lifetime. She was looking at him like he was the only solid thing in the world. On the back of the photograph, in my grandmother's hand, Patricia and Robert Van. Summer 1989. Robert Van. Not a name I knew. Part 2. The Architecture of a Lie. I went home that night, back to my apartment in Columbus, and with the Bible wrapped in the blue velvet cloth and tucked under my arm like contraband. I told my mother I had a migraine. She accepted this with the brisk sympathy she applied to most of my ailments, kissed my cheek, told me to drive safe. I could barely look at her. I sat on my bedroom floor at midnight with all 7 items spread out on the carpet and worked through them in order, as my grandmother had instructed. Item 2 was a letter, handwritten on paper that had gone soft with age, creased from years of folding. It was addressed to my grandmother and signed by someone named Margaret Holloway, and I realized with a start that Margaret Holloway was the name in the Bible. Margaret Holloway, 1962, which meant this Bible had belonged to someone named Margaret, and that Margaret had written this letter to my grandmother. But my grandmother's maiden name was Holloway. I turned to the letter. Edith, I know you told me not to write to you anymore, but I cannot keep this to myself, and there is no one else. Patricia came to see me last week. She is not well, I think, though she would never admit it. She talked about Robert for 2 hours. She is not over him, Edith. I don't think she ever will be. She kept saying that Michael doesn't know, that Michael must never know. I asked her what Michael doesn't know, and she started crying. I've never seen Patricia cry, not since she was small. She left without telling me. But she left her handbag by accident, and when I went to bring it to her, I found... The letter ended there, mid-sentence. The second page, if there had been one, was missing. I set it down carefully. My heart was beating high up in my throat. Michael. My father's name was Michael Morse. He was an accountant, a quiet man, a man who read history books and made perfect scrambled eggs on Sunday mornings, who had died of a heart attack when I was 16. I had grown up in the particular shadow of his absence, in the particular shape of grief that losing a parent young leaves in you. Michael doesn't know. Michael must never know. Item 3, another photograph. This one in color, and recent enough that the color hadn't faded. It showed 2 people. A man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, a good-looking face that carried its age well, and a teenage girl who was standing next to him, grinning at the camera. I recognized the girl. It took me a moment. She was maybe 14 or 15 in this photo, braces on her teeth, hair in a messy ponytail. But I recognized her. It was me. I was standing next to a man I had never met. A man whose name I didn't know, and I had absolutely no memory of this photograph being taken. I turned it over. Robert Van and Claire, July 2014. He found her, Edith. He has been watching. I don't know what to do. The handwriting wasn't my grandmother's this time. I didn't recognize it. I sat very still for a long time. Outside my window, Columbus murmured its nighttime sounds. Distant traffic, a dog somewhere, the particular quiet of a city at rest. I felt completely untethered from all of it. I felt as if the floor beneath me had become uncertain. A man had been watching me. When I was 14 years old, a man whose name I didn't know had apparently been close enough to take a photograph with me, and someone had known about it and not told me. And my grandmother had kept this photograph for 11 years. I picked up item 4. It was a document. Legal paper, notarized, dated June 1992. I had to read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. It was a deed of transfer. The property in question was a house. Not my mother's house. Not Grandma Edith's old farmhouse, but a property I didn't recognize on an address in a town called Garfield, Ohio, 40 miles from Millhaven. The property had been transferred from one William James Holloway, my great-grandfather, I realized, my grandmother's father, to Patricia Ann Holloway Morse. In 1992. My mother had inherited property from her grandfather in 1992. This would not be remarkable except for one thing, printed neatly in the notes section at the bottom of the transfer document. This property and all associated assets transferred in accordance with the last will and testament of William James Holloway, June 1988, superseding the amended will of October 1991. Superseding the amended will of October 1991. I knew enough about legal documents to understand that something had been overridden. There had been an amended will, a newer will, the most recent version. And somehow the older version, the one from Tisicha devet sot vosum desat vosim, had been used instead. I looked at item 5. A photocopy of a handwritten document. At the top, Last Will and Testament of William James Holloway, October 14th, 1991. Beneath the formal language of the opening, I found the relevant section. I bequeath the property at Chitterista Chitternitsit Sycamore Road, Garfield, Ohio, and all assets held therein, in equal shares to my grandchildren, Patricia Ann Holloway and David James Holloway, equally, to both Patricia and David, but the property had been transferred to my mother alone. Using the older will from Tisicha devet sot vosim desat vosim, before my great-grandfather had amended it to include his grandson. I thought of my Uncle David. I thought of his red-rimmed eyes at the funeral. I thought of the distance I had always felt between him and my mother. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of enforced courtesy, like two people being carefully polite over an old wound. Item 6 was a letter from my grandmother, also addressed to no one or perhaps to herself. More of a record than a correspondence, the handwriting cramped and urgent. I confronted Patricia about the will today. She denied knowing anything about it. She said the lawyer made an error, that she had reported it to the probate court, that it was being corrected. But David called the probate court and they have no record of any correction being filed. He showed Patricia the proof and she said the property was in terrible condition and that she had spent more than its value in repairs and that David hadn't put in a cent and therefore he had no right to half of something he had never invested in. She was very calm. She was so calm. I don't know what frightens me more, what she did or how calm she is about it. David has not spoken to her in 3 years. I keep hoping they will find a way. But I think she would have to admit what she did, and I don't think Patricia is capable of that. There is also Robert. I don't know what to do about Robert. Item 7 was last. It was a sealed envelope, my name written on the front, the seal broken. Someone had already opened it and then, I assumed, resealed it with tape. I felt a flicker of something. Not quite anger. Something more complicated. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in a handwriting I did not recognize at all, neither my grandmother's nor any of the others, was a short letter. Dear Claire, I do not expect you to understand or to forgive me. I expect nothing from you at all, and you owe me nothing. But you deserve to know that I exist, and that you are not an accident of biology that I discarded without a second thought. You were wanted. You were loved before you were even born. I respected your mother's choice to build a life with Michael, and I have stayed away as I was asked to stay away. But I have not stayed away entirely, because I am not strong enough for that. I was at your high school graduation. I was at the end of your street the day you moved into your first apartment. I was 20 feet away from you in Millhaven in July of 2014, and someone took a photograph, and it was the happiest and most painful day of my adult life. If you ever want to find me, I am not hard to find. My name is Robert Van. I am your father. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I am sorry I'm only able to tell you this on paper. Robert, Part 3. The Woman in the Calm. I did not sleep. At 4 a.m., I was still on the floor, all 7 items arranged in front of me, the Bible open to no particular page, the blue velvet cloth crushed under my knee. My wine glass from the night before was still on the counter, still with a finger of white wine in the bottom that I had forgotten to drink. I kept thinking about my father. My father Michael, the man I had known, the accountant with the history books and the scrambled eggs. I thought about his face, which I had spent 12 years slowly forgetting in the specific terrible way you forget the dead, feature by feature, until you have to look at photographs to remember the details. I thought about how much I had loved him, how certain I had been that he was mine and I was his. I did not know if any of that changed. I genuinely did not know. What I did know, sitting on that floor at 4 a.m, was that I was angry. Not the hot, bright anger that burns itself out quickly. Something slower, colder, more permanent. The kind of anger that comes when you realize that the story you were told about your own life was not the whole story, that the people responsible for you decided what you were allowed to know about yourself, and they chose to give you less than the truth. I thought about Robert Van, in Columbus, the same city where I had lived for 6 years. I thought about my mother, who had known this my entire life and said nothing. I thought about my grandmother, who had been gathering this evidence for years, tucking it piece by piece into an old Bible, waiting for the right time to tell me. Always waiting. until there was no more time left. I thought about Uncle David, cheated out of his inheritance by his own sister and still showing up to her mother's funeral, still sitting in the same church pew, still being family in the careful, constrained way that people manage when the alternative is losing the last family they have. At some point, I fell asleep on the floor. When I woke up, it was gray November morning, and I had a crick in my neck and absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. I drove back to Millhaven the next morning. I had not called ahead. I parked in my mother's driveway at 10:30 and sat in the car for 3 minutes, which was exactly how long it took me to talk myself out of turning around and going home. She answered the door in her robe, which was unusual enough that I registered it. My mother was not a woman who received visitors, even her own daughter, in a robe at 10:30 in the morning. She looked briefly, surprised to see me. Then the familiar composure slid back into place. "Claire, I didn't know you were coming." "I know," I said. "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door and I walked into the house, into the kitchen, and sat down at the table. She put the kettle on without asking and stood with her back to me, getting mugs from the cabinet, and I looked at the back of her, the precise set of her shoulders, the careful way she moved, and tried to find, in the architecture of her familiar body, some evidence of the woman in that photograph. The woman looking up at someone like he was the only solid thing in the world. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you about Robert Van." The kettle was not yet boiling. The kitchen was quiet. My mother stood with her hand on the cabinet door, not moving, not turning around. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly even. "Grandma left me something. A Bible. There were things inside it." A long pause. The kettle began to murmur. "I see," she said. She turned around then, and I saw, for just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it, something collapse in her face. Some wall coming down. Then it went back up, and she was my mother again, composed and careful. She poured the hot water into the mugs. She set one in front of me. She sat down across the table and wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "Your grandmother," she said, "was a woman who believed very strongly in the power of the truth, even when the truth was more complicated than it looked from the outside." "Was she wrong?" I asked. Another pause. "No," my mother said. "She wasn't wrong." She looked down at her mug. "I have been thinking about how to have this conversation for a very long time. I imagined it differently. I imagine most people don't imagine having it the day after their mother's funeral," I said. I hadn't meant it to come out quite so sharp, but I did not apologize for it. She looked up at me. "Robert Van was someone I loved very much," she said, "when I was young, before I married your father." "Michael," I said. "My father?" "Yes." She hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Michael." "My father, Michael," I said again, holding her gaze, and I watched her understand that I meant it as a question and not a statement. She set down her mug. "Claire," she said, "I read the letter, Mom. The one he wrote. Robert Van. It was in the Bible." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had changed. The composure was still there. It never fully left. It was structural, built into her. But beneath it, there was something raw. Something human in a way my mother rarely allowed herself to be. "He wasn't supposed to write that," she said softly. "He's my father." "Michael Morse was your father," she said, and her voice was fierce suddenly. "He raised you. He loved you. He was there every day of your life until—" She stopped. "Blood is not the only thing that makes a father, Claire." "You're right," I said. "But it is the thing that you get to decide whether or not to tell your daughter, and you decided not to." She looked away toward the window where the November garden was gray and stripped down, nothing beautiful left in it. "When I found out I was pregnant," she said, "Robert and I were already over. We had been over for 6 months. I had met Michael by then. Michael was—" She paused, searching. "Michael was gentle. Robert was everything. And when everything ends, there is nothing. It destroys you. Michael was safe. Michael was kind. And he wanted to be your father. He knew, Claire. I told him before we got married. He chose you anyway." I sat with this for a moment. He knew. He never treated you as anything but his own. That was not a lie. Whatever else was complicated, that was not. I thought about my father, Michael, and the steady, undemonstrative way he had loved me. I thought about how I had sometimes wished as a child that he was more expressive, more effusive. Now I thought, he was loving someone else's child with everything he had, quietly, without requiring recognition for it. And I had not known, and he had never asked me to know. My chest ached in a way that was completely separate from my anger. Robert Van lives in Columbus, I said. She tensed. He told me he was at my graduation, I said. He said he was on my street when I moved in. He said there's a photograph from 2014 when he was 20 feet away from me. I paused. Mom, he's been watching my life from a distance for years and you didn't tell me he existed. I asked him to stay away, she said. You asked him. Did you ask me? The silence stretched. I was trying to protect you, she said. From what? From... She stopped, started again. From complication? From disruption? From having to rebuild your entire understanding of your family while you were still a child, while Michael was still alive, while everything was... Her hands tightened around the mug. From pain, Claire. I was trying to protect you from pain. You were protecting yourself, I said. Not cruelly, just accurately. She didn't answer. And what about Uncle David? I said. She went very still. The will, I said. Your grandfather's amended will. The property in Garfield that was supposed to be split between you and David. The color changed in her face. Claire? He hasn't spoken to you properly in decades, Mom. He sat 2 seats away from you at his own mother's funeral. How is that protecting anyone from pain? That is a much more complicated situation than you understand. Then explain it to me. She stood up from the table, suddenly, the way people do when they need to move, when staying still has become physically impossible. She went to the window and stood with her back to me again. The property was in terrible disrepair, she said. David had never contributed a single dollar to its upkeep. He had ignored every letter, every call, every request for help when our grandfather was alive and couldn't manage it himself. I spent years and years and most of my savings. You used an older version of the will, I said. The amended will was made under pressure. Her voice hardened. My grandfather was 83 years old and his memory was going and someone talked him into adding David, who had done nothing. Mom. I kept my voice very quiet. You stole from your brother. The word stole landed like a stone in still water. I watched her back, the set of those shoulders, and I could see the effort it took her not to turn around. The law considered it valid, she said finally. There was never a legal ruling against... I'm not talking about the law, I said. I'm talking about what you know you did. A very long silence. Yes, she said. So quietly I barely heard it. I know what I did. I waited. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but her face was stripped open in a way I had never seen it before. Not at her husband's funeral, not at her mother's, not in any of the arguments or crises of my entire life. I've spent 30 years, she said, trying to build something solid. Trying to give you a stable, safe, predictable life. And yes, I made choices to protect that stability. Yes, I controlled what you knew because I genuinely believed, that you would be better off not knowing. And maybe I was also protecting myself. I am not... Her voice faltered. It actually faltered. I am not perfect, Claire. I have never claimed to be. I know, I said. But you claim to be honest. She flinched. That's what hurts, I said. Not the secrets themselves. It's that you taught me that honesty was the most important thing. You said it to me 100 times. You were relentless about it when I was a kid. Anytime I lied about anything, you said there was nothing worse than a person who couldn't be honest. And you were doing this the entire time. She stood very still. You're right, she said. It was not the conversation I had expected. I had expected more defense, more control, more carefully constructed justification. What I had not expected was this. My mother, in her robe, in her empty kitchen the morning after she buried her own mother, saying you're right and looking like it cost her something real. I did not feel triumph. I felt exhausted and sad and strangely tender toward her in spite of everything. She was my mother. Whatever complicated, contradictory, deeply flawed person she was She was my mother, and I had loved her my whole life, and that did not simply stop. I need some time, I said. She nodded. But I'm going to contact Robert Van, I said. I think you should know that. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes, she said. I understand. Part 4, The Man on the Other Side of a Letter. I found him in 40 minutes on the internet, which felt both absurdly easy and somehow symbolic of the modern age, that a secret kept for nearly 3 decades could be undone by a Google search. Robert Van, Columbus, Ohio. He ran a small architecture firm, just 3 employees, specialized in residential renovation. His website had a photograph of him on the About page. I sat in my car outside my mother's house and looked at the photograph on my phone. He was 61, according to his bio. Silver-haired now, but the face was still well-structured, still carrying what must have been striking good looks in his 30s. He had eyes that were a very specific shade of gray-green, and I looked at them for a long time. And then I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, and the gray-green came right back at me. I had spent my whole life assuming I had Michael's eyes. Michael had had blue eyes. I had always been told mine were kind of blue, kind of green, hard to say. My mother's eyes were brown. I drove home to Columbus. I did not contact Robert Van that day. I needed a week first. A week of sitting with everything, of rereading my grandmother's letter, of looking at those 7 items until I had memorized every word and crease. A week of crying in the shower, of calling my best friend Jessie and telling her the broad outline without the details, of lying awake at 3 a.m., reconstructing my history. I thought about my father Michael constantly, about who he had actually been. Not the simplified, grief-softened version I'd carried for 12 years, but the real person. A man who had married a woman pregnant with another man's child and raised that child with steadfast, undemonstrative love and gone to his grave without ever telling me. I did not know whether to call that noble or sad or both. I suspected it was both. I thought about my grandmother, who had been gathering evidence for years, who had been watching her daughter live with these secrets and had felt all that time the pressure of knowing, who had loved Patricia and could not condone her, who had trusted that I was strong enough to hold the truth. None of what you discover will change who you are. That was what she had written. You are remarkable, Claire. You are more yourself than anyone I have ever known. I turned that over and over like a stone in my pocket. On the 8th day after the funeral, I sent an email to Robert Van through his architecture firm's contact form. I kept it very simple. My name is Claire Morse. I believe you knew my mother, Patricia Holloway. I recently read a letter you wrote. I would like to meet you if you're willing. Claire. He replied in 4 hours. Claire. I have been hoping for 28 years that I would one day receive a message like this. I am willing. I am more than willing. I will meet you wherever and whenever you feel comfortable. I won't push for more than you want to give. I am just very glad you wrote. Robert Van. We met at a coffee shop. I chose one I had never been to, in a neighborhood of Columbus I rarely visited, because I didn't want the weight of a familiar place on top of everything else. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat facing the door. He walked in at exactly the time we'd agreed. He was taller than I'd expected. He wore a gray coat that matched his hair. He spotted me immediately. How? I wondered. He had last seen me at a distance, in a photograph, 11 years ago. But he spotted me with no hesitation, walked straight to my table, and stood there with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and found in the actual moment that none of the rehearsal applies. Claire, he said. Robert, I said. He sat down. We ordered coffee from the server, who appeared at exactly the wrong moment. When she left, there was a brief silence that felt very large. I don't know where to start, he said. Tell me about my mother, I said. When you were young, what she was like. He looked slightly surprised. Then he smiled, and the smile was startling because I had seen that smile in the mirror. I had made that exact expression with my own face 1,000 times, and seeing it on someone else's face was a vertiginous thing. Your mother, he said, when she was 22 years old, was the most brilliant and terrifying person I had ever met. She walked into a room and completely reorganized the energy of it without even trying. She was funny, in this very dry, precise way that made you feel like you were the only one smart enough to get the joke. She was... He paused. She was capable of extraordinary love. She just wasn't always able to give it to the right people, or in the right way. What happened to you? Between the two of you? He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. His hands, I noticed, were like mine. The same long fingers, the same slightly squared nails. I wasn't ready, he said simply. I was 24 and she was everything and I was afraid of everything and I made choices that hurt her and she walked away. And she was right to walk away. I spent years after that growing into someone who would not have made those choices. But by then she was with Michael, and then she was pregnant, and then she called me and told me and... He stopped. She told you about me, I said. She told me she was pregnant. She did not say it was mine. Not then. Not for years. It was only... He exhaled. When you were about 3 years old, I received a letter from her. Just saying that she thought I deserved to know. That was all. No request, no invitation, no... It was just information. She wanted me to have it. And then nothing. No reply expected. No reply possible, really, without threatening the life she'd built. But you stayed close. Somehow. I stayed in Columbus, he said. I told myself it was for work reasons. It wasn't entirely for work reasons. A brief, rueful look. I never interfered. I want you to know that. I never tried to insert myself or disrupt anything or... You were on my street, I said, when I moved in. I know, he said. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you were watching me. Yes. He didn't try to soften it. I was watching from a very great distance, and I understand that is not nothing. And I understand if you find it uncomfortable. I would understand if you never wanted to see me again after today. He looked at me steadily. You were a person I had some claim on in the most biological of senses, and I chose to respect your mother's wishes and stay away. And I don't regret that choice, but it was not always easy. I looked at him across the table. I tried to feel something definitive. Anger or warmth, or the seismic sense of something clicking into place. What I felt instead was something quieter and stranger. The odd, vertiginous recognition of finding a face that knows your face. Of sitting across from someone who did not raise you, did not know you, has no claim on the person you became, and yet carries your eyes in your hands and the specific shape of your smile. I don't want to call you my father, I said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know. I understand, he said. But I'd like to know you, I said. I think I'd like to know who you are, and what you're like, and why my grandmother kept a photograph of you from 1979. He looked startled. Then he laughed. And it was a good laugh, a real one, and I recognized it. And it was strange, and it was not entirely bad. Your grandmother, he said, was a remarkable woman. She reached out to me about 12 years ago. She wrote me a letter and said she thought Claire should know the truth when she was ready. And would I be willing to write something down? I wrote that letter you read. She kept it for years. He shook his head. She wanted to be sure there was someone on this side of the door if you chose to open it. My grandmother, who had been gathering evidence for years and reaching out to Robert Van and writing letters and sealing envelopes and putting everything inside a Bible and waiting for the right moment. Who had been trying to give me what she believed I was owed. I thought about what she had written. I love you more than I have ever been able to say properly. I thought, maybe this is how she said it. All of this. This was the love. Part 5. The thing about the truth. 2 weeks after my meeting with Robert Van, I drove to my uncle's house. David Morse, my father's brother, I now had to remind myself, not related to me by blood at all, though this did almost nothing to change how I felt about him. Lived 40 minutes from Millhaven in a house that always felt more like home to me than my mother's house had. He had a fireplace he actually used, and dogs, and a wife who cooked from scratch and hugged you like she meant it. He opened the door and looked at me, and I could see on his face that he already knew why I was there. Your grandmother called me, he said. Months ago. She said she'd left you the Bible and she wanted to make sure you knew to come to me. She trusted you, I said. She trusted me. He agreed. He stepped back from the door. Come in. Maureen made soup. We sat at his kitchen table and I told him what I had found and what I had done. He listened without interrupting. When I told him about meeting Robert Van, something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, more like the confirmation of a long-held suspicion. I always wondered, he said. About your father, about the timing. Michael and Patricia had only been together. What, a year? And then suddenly they were married and you were on the way. I thought that was fast. But Michael loved you so completely that it didn't matter to me. He did, I said. He did, David confirmed. Whatever else is complicated here, Claire. Michael Morse loved you with everything he had. I watched it every day. That is not complicated. I folded my hands around the soup bowl. Outside, November was still being November. Tell me about the property, I said. In Garfield. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your grandfather James, on the Holloway side, amended his will the year before he died. He had left everything to Patricia in an older version, partly because I was young and partially estranged and partially because he was a difficult man who played favorites. But he changed his mind near the end. He added me. He was clear about it. And then he died, and Patricia used the older will. He stopped. She told me it was a legal technicality. She told me I had no case. Maybe she was right about the law, but she knew what our grandfather had wanted. She knew. Did you ever try to fix it? For years. And then he picked up his coffee. At some point, you have to decide what something costs you. The legal fight would have cost me more than the inheritance was worth. And it would have meant a public, ugly war with my sister, and my mother was still alive, and He shook his head. I let it go. I told myself I had let it go. I am not certain I entirely did. David, I said, I'm sorry. He looked at me, surprised. For what? You didn't do anything. I'm sorry it happened. I'm sorry she did it. She's my mother and I love her and I stopped. She does damage sometimes. She doesn't see it as damage, but it is. He set down his coffee and looked at me for a long moment. You are very much your grandmother's girl, he said. You know that? Something cracked open in my chest. I pressed my lips together. I hope so, I said. I called my mother the following Sunday. Not to continue the argument, not to demand more, just to call. She answered on the second ring, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. About her garden, about my work, about a book she was reading. Ordinary things. The conversation we might have had any Sunday before any of this. Near the end, she said, I'm going to call David. I didn't say anything. I don't know that I can fix what I did, she said, but I'm going to call him. Okay, I said. Another pause. Your grandmother would have approved of you, she said, in case you wondered. I know, I said. She told me. Epilogue. What the Bible knew, it is spring now. 6 months since the funeral, since the Bible, since the particular Tuesday in November that reorganized everything I thought I understood about my life. My mother called David. They have had 3 conversations that I know of. It is not reconciliation. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the full sense. But it is something. A door cracked open where there was a wall. I have had coffee with Robert Van 4 times. We talk about architecture, which he loves with a specificity and passion that I find myself genuinely interested in. We talk about books. We talk sometimes around the edges of the harder things. About my mother when they were young, about what he wished he had been brave enough to do differently. He does not push. He is learning, in his 60s, to have patience with slow things, with things that grow on their own timeline. Last month, he showed me a photo he had saved. A newspaper photograph from my high school graduation ceremony. Very small, barely identifiable. He had circled one figure in the crowd with a faint pencil mark. Me, in a cap and gown, laughing at something someone had just said. I was there, he said. I know, I said. He looked at me carefully. Does that bother you? I thought about it. Ask me in a year, I said. Right now, mostly, it makes me sad for you. He nodded. He seemed to find this acceptable. The Bible sits on my bedside table. I read it sometimes, not always the scripture. Sometimes just the front pages. The handwritten name, E. Margaret Holloway. 1992. Trying to construct from that name a whole person, a woman I never knew, who also moved through this family carrying things she couldn't say. The Bible passed from her to my grandmother. My grandmother filled it with evidence and wrapped it in blue velvet and made sure it found its way to me. There are women in my family who kept secrets out of fear, and women who kept them out of love. And sometimes those were the same woman on different days. I am not sure I am in any position to judge them for it. I am 28 years old, and I am still learning what it costs to tell the truth and what it costs not to. But I know this. I would rather know. Even when knowing is hard. Even when it reorganizes everything. Even when it leaves you sitting on a bedroom floor at 4 in the morning, surrounded by old letters, trying to reconstruct the true shape of your life. My grandmother knew this about me. She trusted that I was strong enough to hold the truth, that knowing would not undo me. She trusted me more than she trusted her own fear. I keep her Bible on my bedside table as a reminder. Not of the secrets it carried, of the woman who carried it and who believed that what waited on the other side of the truth was not devastation, but something truer. Something more solidly mine. She was right. She was usually right. I miss her every day.